Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name's Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about Matthew 24, whether or not the chapter can be divided. Matthew 24 is known as the Olivet Discourse, as you probably know. And Jesus gave it in approximately the year AD 30 or AD 33. It was about a week before his crucifixion. And many Christians acknowledge that verses 1 to 34 in Matthew 24 have been fulfilled already. These passages talk about such things as the abomination of desolation, and wars and rumors of wars, and false messiahs, and tribulation, and Jesus coming on clouds of glory. Then in verse 34, Jesus said all these things would happen within this generation or within his generation. So many Christians acknowledge that this entire section has been fulfilled already. However, these Christians also say that verses 35 onward refer to another coming. This is where Jesus talks about heaven and earth passing away and nobody knows the day and hour. So many Christians say this section has still not been fulfilled 2,000 years later. This view, by the way, is called partial preterism. The term preterism, as you probably know, basically means past or fulfilled. And since these Christians believe part of Matthew 24 has been fulfilled and part has not, then they call themselves partial preterists. And these partial preterists call the people who believe that verses 1 to 34 have not been fulfilled yet. They call these people futurists because they believe, parts of verses 1 to 34 are still future. So partial preterists believe Matthew 24 verses 1 to 34 have been fulfilled, yet verses 35 onward have not been fulfilled. And futurists believe even parts of verses 1 to 34 have not been fulfilled yet. They're still future. Some advocates of partial preterism include people like Kenneth Gentry and Steve Gregg. And some proponents of futurism include Calvary Chapel and many other fundamentalist evangelical churches or church pastors. Now, personally, I don't like the term partial preterist because both of these camps believe at least part of Matthew 24 has been fulfilled. For example, both believe the temple was destroyed in the year AD 70, which Jesus predicted in verse 2. So they're both partial preterists, at least in this sense. It's just a matter of degree. And they're also both futurists because they believe parts of Matthew 24 have not been fulfilled yet. Again, it's just a matter of degree, right? Partial preterists believe that verses 1 to 34 have been fulfilled and 35 onward have not. And futurists believe even parts of verses 1 to 34 have not been fulfilled. Personally, I think the only people who should be called preterists are people like me who believe the entire chapter, Matthew 24, has been fulfilled. Everyone else should rightfully be called futurists because they believe parts of Matthew 24 are still future. That's just my view on this, by the way. But for this discussion's sake, let's just call them what they want to be called. Let's just say partial preterists are those who believe verses 1 to 34 have been fulfilled, yet Matthew verses 35 forward have not been fulfilled yet. And then futurists are those who believe that even parts of verses 1 to 34 have not been fulfilled yet. So hopefully I didn't confuse you with all this. Okay, so let me get to the topic now. Can Matthew 25 be divided? Okay, so if you're familiar with Matthew 24, again, it's called the Olivet Discourse. It begins with Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple in verse 2. And after which the disciples ask in verse 3 when it would happen. They ask, quote, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, the reason why the disciples automatically thought coming of the Lord after Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple is because to a biblically literate Jew in that day, such a judgment or destruction equated to a coming of the Lord. God the Father came on clouds many times in Old Testament times. You can see examples of this in Isaiah 19:1, or Isaiah 13, verse 9 to 13, or Ezekiel 32, verse 7 to 15. By the way, I have an entire video about this called What is the Coming of the Lord? I'll put a link to that video in the video notes below if you're interested. But suffice it to say that a coming of the Lord refers to judgment and destruction. So when Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple in verse 2, the disciples automatically thought coming of the Lord, and they wanted to know when it would happen, as they ask in verse 3. Then Jesus listed all the precursors that would happen, such as false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, the abomination of desolation, great tribulation, etc. And then in verse 30, Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation, they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of glory. This is a reference to the destruction of the temple that Jesus predicted in verse 2. As I just said, a coming of the Lord refers to destruction and judgment. Then Jesus answers the timing question in verse 34. Quote, assuredly I say to you, and he's talking to his first century disciples, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. This is Matthew 24, verse 34. So Jesus said all these things would happen within his generation. So partial preterists acknowledge that all this has been fulfilled, right, in the time period leading up to AD 70. Jesus came on clouds, and that was the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But then in verse 35, Jesus said, quote, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But of that day and hour nobody knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Okay, so partial preterists say this section has still not been fulfilled. They justify this by pointing out that Jesus talks about the passing of heaven and earth, and Jesus saying, but of that day, nobody knows the day and hour. So partial preterists say Jesus knew about the timing of the coming of the Lord that happened within his generation, but they say that he didn't know the timing of the final coming of the Lord, right? That's still future according to them. That's why Jesus said, but of that day, nobody knows the day and hour. So are partial preterists right about this? I don't think so, for a number of reasons. Actually, I have 6 reasons why I don't believe that partial preterists are right. Number 1, neither Jesus nor Matthew, and I'm talking about the author of the book of Matthew, said anything about 2 different comings anywhere in the context of Matthew 24. Had they had 2 different comings in mind, surely one of them, either Jesus or Matthew, the author, would have said something to that effect. Yet neither of them did. Now, you can read that into Jesus saying, but of that day and hour, nobody knows. I mean, you can read that into it, but it's certainly not clear. I think if Jesus had 2 different comings in mind, Jesus or Matthew would have said so. I mean, they would have said, okay, that's one coming, but here's a different coming. And I think they would have been clear about that. But they obviously they didn't say anything about 2 different comings. Now, what about the reference to the passing of heaven and earth? There are many responses I can give to this. The first is this. The first century historian Josephus said in his writings that the Jews called the temple heaven and earth. The Jews believed the temple was the place where God, or heaven, met with his people, or earth. So the Jews called the temple heaven and earth, according to Josephus. And when that temple was destroyed, then heaven and earth passed away. So this could very well be what Jesus is referring to. Another way of looking at the passing of heaven and earth is that it simply refers to the passing of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant was God's method or system, heaven, of dealing or communicating with his people, earth. So when the Old Covenant passed away, then heaven and earth passed away. By the way, I have an entire video about this called The Passing of Heaven and Earth. I'll leave a video, or I'll leave a link to that video too in the video notes below if you're interested. But that's what I think the passing of heaven and earth refers to, the passing of the old covenant. It was the heaven and earth of Jesus's day was God's method, which is heaven, of dealing with this people, earth. And when the old covenant passed away, then heaven and earth passed away. And today we're living under a new heaven and earth, or a new covenant. So that's what I think it refers to. So when Jesus said heaven and earth would pass away, Jesus was referring to the passing of the old covenant, or as Josephus said, the passing of or the destruction of the temple. Either one of those fits the context perfectly. But what about Jesus saying he didn't know the day or hour, you might be wondering. Jesus said he knew that the coming of the Lord, which referred to the destruction of the temple, would happen within his generation, but he said he didn't know when the coming would happen in verses 35 and onward. So this must be referring to a different coming, partial preterists say. My response is this. I think Jesus was talking about the same event or the same coming in both sections. It's true Jesus did not know the exact day and hour, but he sure knew the generation because he said so. So just because he said he didn't know the exact day and hour doesn't mean he didn't know the generation. He knew it would happen within the lifetimes of the people he was talking to, or within that generation, although he didn't know the exact day and hour. I think he's talking about the same event in both passages. He didn't know the exact day and hour, but he knew it would happen within the lifetimes of the people he was talking to. Okay, point 2. If partial preterists are right that Jesus was referring to two different comings in Matthew 24, then Luke, the author of the book of Luke, was mistaken. Take a look at the following chart. Okay, so as this chart shows, both Matthew 24 and Luke 17 mention the same 5 events, right? They both mention, they both say, let him who's on the housetop now not go down to take anything out of his house. They both mention that. They both mention, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. They both mention, or they both say, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered. They both say, but as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. And they both say 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other left. Okay, so they both talk about these 5 events, right? Yet they mention them in different order. And partial preterists say the first 3, which are mentioned in Matthew 24, verses 1 to 34, happened in the 1st century, yet they say that the last 2 events, which are mentioned in verses 35 onward, are still future. But Luke mentions the same 5 events in a completely different order. Some of the events partial preterists say happened or will happen in the future. Luke puts before the events that partial preterists say happened in AD 70. So either Luke was mistaken or partial preterists are wrong. I'll put my money on the latter. I think partial preterists are wrong about this. I think it's obvious that all the events would happen in roughly the same time period leading up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Okay, point 3. We could also be sure Jesus was referring to the same coming all throughout Matthew 24 because he uses the same Greek word, parousia, which means coming, which is translated coming in our English Bibles. So he uses that same word, parousia, in both parts of the chapter. Okay, look at the following chart. As this chart shows, Jesus used that word, parousia, twice in the first part of the chapter in verses 1 to 34, and he used it twice in the second part of the chapter, verses 35 onward. So if Jesus was referring to 2 different comings in these passages, don't you think he would have used a different word to describe these comings? If for no other reason than to avoid confusion. Or at least he would have said, in the second part that he's referring to a different event. Again, for no other reason than to avoid confusion. But he didn't. Why? Because it was the same event. It was the same coming. the one he said would happen within a generation. He didn't know the exact day and hour, but he knew it would happen within, that generation. Okay, point 4. Still another reason we know Matthew 24 cannot be divided is that Jesus is addressing the same group of people, his disciples, all through the entire discourse. The pronouns you and your make this crystal clear. For example, Jesus says in verse 2, do you not see all these things? And he's talking about the temple stones. He's talking to his disciples and he's pointing out the temple stones, right? So he says, do you not see these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone will be left here upon another that will not be thrown down. So he's telling his disciples that the temple would be destroyed. Then in verse 4, he says, take heed that no one deceives you. So he's still talking to his disciples, right? The same people. Take heed that nobody deceives you. Then he goes on to say in verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation. He's still talking to his disciples. Then in verse 20, pray that your flight may not be in winter. Still talking to his disciples. Then in verse 23, if anyone asks you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. Then in verse 33, when you see all these things, and he's talking about the precursors, know that it is near, even at the door. Then in verse 34, he says, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So he's still talking to his disciples. Assuredly I say to you. Then in verse 42, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour the Lord is coming. He's still talking to his disciples, for you do not know. Then in verse 47, assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. So he's still talking to his disciples. You. Jesus is addressing the same disciples, the ones that were, sitting right in front of him when he gave the discourse, all through the entire chapter. There is not even a hint of an audience change anywhere in the Olivet Discourse or anywhere in Matthew 24. Had Jesus had a different audience in mind, thousands of years later, he would have said, they will see such and such, not you will see such and such. The reason he said you is because he expected his generation to witness all those events. Point 5. Still another reason why the Olivet Discourse cannot be divided is because right after describing the precursors, in the first section, and remember, Jesus talked about such things as false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, famine, earthquakes, abomination of desolation, the Great Tribulation. Then after mentioning all these precursors in verses 1 to 34, Jesus goes on in the second section in verse 42 to tell his disciples to watch for these precursors. Quote, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. He says this in verse 42. So Jesus told his disciples to watch for those precursors because they would indicate that the coming of the Lord was near. He's obviously referring to the same event in both sections. Again, while Jesus did not know the exact day and hour, he sure knew about the precursors that would happen, and he said that they would be the signal that the coming of the Lord was near. So when they saw those precursors happening, they would know the coming of the Lord is near. And that's why Jesus said to watch for those precursors in verse 42. He's talking about the same event. That's pretty obvious. Okay, point 6. Last but not least, if the book of Matthew refers to 2 different comings, then that would mean there are 3 comings, not 2 comings. Jesus' first coming was when he sacrificed himself for sin during his earthly ministry. His second coming was when he came on clouds in AD 70. And by the way, even partial preterists admit that Jesus came on clouds in AD 70. So that would be his second coming. So his third coming, if that's really the case, would be the one that's still future. The problem with this is that the Bible never talks about a third coming. In fact, in Hebrews 9, verse 26 to 28, the writer specifically mentions 2 different comings. Here's what the passage says. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So this is his first coming. This happened at the end of the ages, which was in the time period leading from 80-30 to 80-70. So that was the end of the ages. It was the end of the Old Covenant age. And that's when Jesus appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. That was the first coming. And then the passage goes on to say, to those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. So that's Jesus' second coming. Again, this is Hebrews 9, verse 26 to 28. So Jesus was only supposed to come twice. Once to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself on the cross, and that happened during his earthly ministry. And then a second time apart from sin to complete salvation. So if Jesus came in AD 70, then that would have been his second coming. And any future coming would be a third coming, which the Bible never talks about. Hebrews said there would only be 2 different comings of the Lord, not 3. So for these 6 reasons, I think we can be absolutely sure Matthew 24 is talking about the same coming all through the entire chapter. And this coming happened in AD 70, exactly when Jesus said it would within his generation. Jesus didn't know the exact day and hour, but he sure knew it would happen within a generation, and he sure knew the precursors that would happen, and that's why he told his disciples to watch for those precursors in the second part of the chapter, because he knew about the precursors, although he didn't know the exact day and hour. But he did know it would happen within his generation, and that judgment did happen in the year AD 70. And that's when the temple was destroyed. That's when Jerusalem was destroyed. 1.1 million Jews died during that event, according to Josephus. Another 97,000 people were taken into slavery. So Jesus came on clouds of glory, just like he said he would in AD 70. So I think that Matthew 24 is talking about one single event all the way through it. I mean, one single time period. Okay, so that is it for today. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please do me a huge favor. Hit the like button. If you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. Also, for more detailed information about the topics discussed in this video, get my book called The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. I discuss topics such as the second coming, the resurrection, the end times, the new heaven and earth, and a whole lot more. So if you're interested in eschatology, get my book. Also, you can go to my website, thebiblefulfilled.com. I have a bunch of free articles and videos there, so check that out too if you're interested. Okay, so thanks again for watching. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.